Hello, everyone, and welcome to our weekly philosophical talks with S.Friedman. And first of all, we would like to thank the U.S. Consulate General here in Almaty, also American Space Almaty, for organizing this great event with such an amazing speaker, S.Friedman. Thank you very much for joining us today. I wish you all good luck. I wish you all to have great discussion, and please feel free to ask questions and give your comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aaliyah. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this morning. It's evening. Actually, it's 1 hour later in Los Angeles than it typically is. We advanced our clocks 1 hour. So it's your morning. It's closer to midnight for me, but I think I tend to work well, late at night. So that shouldn't be an impediment. I would, as is custom, I'd like to thank everyone involved in making this possible. The American Consulate in Almaty, Elmira, Tracy, Aaliyah, our moderator, and Consul General Eric Meyer. As always, I appreciate the opportunity to present philosophical perspectives. For me, the philosophical perspective is the most valuable of all perspectives because it's the one perspective that when done well, when done carefully, when developed judiciously, is incontrovertible. It's the ultimate security in that it represents absolute, incontrovertible truth. And it's a relatively sort of simple notion. Whatever is not incontestable is not part of philosophy. That includes the propositions of science. We've talked about this a number of times, that science cannot do a perfectly controlled experiment in an asymmetrical space. We live in an asymmetrical space. The world is different in different directions. Science gives us approximations. It gives us guidelines that can help us act, help us survive, help us work towards specific ends based upon regularities that it discerns in nature that may continue to persist, but cannot be guaranteed to do so. Philosophy is only interested in what can be guaranteed. So that again is its power, and that's its privilege. Tonight's talk, or this morning's talk, is on the nature of the self, which is an elusive, a seemingly easy topic to address, but because of its centrality, it can be approached from an infinite number of directions. And so the task of exploring it and clarifying it and understanding approaches to its appreciation, understanding its role in the history of philosophy, but even more importantly, its role for us. The importance of achieving the kind of understanding that ultimately is a liberating understanding, something that frees us from various types of constraints, presuppositions, what we imagine to be limitations that are ultimately illusory, presumptive claims that cannot stand the test of rigor. There are always lots of ways to approach organizing a talk like this. Sometimes I sort of imagine doing it in a logical sequence of development. Sometimes I like the idea of starting from the end, revealing the result or the conclusion, and then sort of demonstrating in various ways how it's supported or how it's ultimately, is developed and what its ultimate significance is. Other times, I like to start at the beginning and almost chronicle like the sequence of ideas that came into my mind when thinking about the topic. When I write philosophy, aphoristically, in concentrated statements, the riddle of the world is an object. The meaning of the world is its most general representation. The aphorisms represent a distillation, a concentration of results, but they're almost always written down, and they almost always assume book form in the sequence in which they come to me, or in which they're developed. Because I think the sequence gives more information, additional information, valuable information in terms of the relationship of ideas and the processes, by which they develop, and the various ways in which they're connected. So it's illuminating in and of itself. Well, when I thought of today's topic, I'm going to make that mistake repeatedly because I'm aware of the fact that it's later. The first thing that came to mind, and the topic is really in relation to the Delphic Oracle, know thyself. What is the self? How can one know it? We'll talk a little bit about the significance of that statement in the Delphic Oracle in the history of philosophy and what that really amounts to. But what first came to my mind was, well, the question, what am I? And what then came into my mind was a poem by Emily Dickinson. Now, I think people that have been following these talks, know that she is the poet that I most embrace. She was an influence on my own style of writing poetry, and is one of, well, there are various times when I've considered her the most valuable of all writers, because she deals with the plight of our circumstances, as it's been put, of being trapped in time, being a consciousness trapped in time. And she's writing from that embedded perspective, that existential perspective, which turns out to be the most valuable of all, especially in terms of achieving philosophical results. Well, the poem that entered my mind was, I'm nobody. Who are you? Are you nobody too? Then there's a pair of us. Don't tell, they'd advertise, how dreary to be somebody. How public, like a frog, telling one's name the livelong June to an admiring bog. Emily Dickinson, right? It's concentrated. My writing is concentrated, so I admire that style. And it's prescient, and it's infused with a religious spirit, a religious orientation. And in this instance, that orientation is one of humility, right? Not claiming too much, certainly not asserting or claiming or being presumptuous about oneself, one's status. Well, it coheres with the general orientation of philosophy, which resists or shows that most of the claims that we make are not rigorously justified. And so when we feel trapped within a claim, when we feel that, this is how things are, and there's no way around it, well, philosophy can beg to differ and say, no, this is how you imagine things to be. But your imagining is limiting your understanding of your true circumstances. It's a spirit, that spirit of humility, that also intersects that comment by Meister Eckhart's daughter that I talked about in particular last time. I am a something among some things, and so I go, in the sense that there's a resistance to categorization. There's a sense that whatever claims we might make about ourselves are not fully legitimate, fully substantiatable claims. Now, from the standpoint that we're going to be exploring, there are good reasons for that, not fairly clear and demonstrable reasons, but I'll develop that in a little bit. But again, so we're dealing with sort of coming to terms with something that our claims about might be, more than are typically merited, again, by the rigor of our circumstance. So, but humility is one sort of aspect that features into our assessment, our evaluation of selfhood. From the opposite direction, in contemporary culture, there's the selfie, the phenomenon of the selfie. And that is in the opposite direction in a number of ways. First of all, in terms of an almost obsessive, interest in the self, one's presence. But what's most problematic about the selfie is it might be seen as one of the most powerful instruments of human unhappiness imaginable, and not for reasons that people might be dissatisfied, with their appearance, which can be a factor. That's not important philosophically. What is important philosophically is, and what's the deeper, aspect of the unhappiness that the selfie in principle cultivates, is when we are seeing ourselves in a selfie, we're not seeing ourselves. We're not experiencing the self. The experiencer is the self. What we're really doing is experiencing ourselves from the outside, as if we were outside of the world, looking in on ourselves in the context of our environment. And I've made the point a number of times that one fundamental way to represent the ultimate source of human unhappiness is this tendency to think that we can see the world from outside the world. It's actually a crippling sort of tendency of thought, and it's ultimately grounded in the nature of language, the fact that language is a social institution, and as a social institution, we want to be seeing ourselves as part of a group. And so where the focus is not primarily on ourselves, but on our relation, to the group, a group of, in some sense, equals. Well, I've mentioned too in the past that the strongest results in the history of thought, results including existentialism, including the work of Einstein, including the work of Heisenberg, represent an attempt to describe the world from within the world. And the reason that is so compelling philosophically is we can't ever leave the world to see it from the outside. And so that's not a platform from which we can gain definitive knowledge, that from which we can make irrefutable claims. Whatever irrefutable claims can be made, whatever incontrovertible propositions can be put forth about our condition must be put forth from where we are. Okay? So philosophy has to position itself from where we are, because that's the only point that we can, in principle, ever occupy. Everything else is possibility. And when we're talking about the realm of possibility, the realm of belief, opinion, we're talking about the heuristic, right? When we're talking about the incontrovertible, the philosophical, what can be known without any shadow of a doubt, we're talking about the epistemic. And the only thing that can be known with no shadow of a doubt is what can be known from our circumstances, since we can never leave them. Okay? So, and we see this, an intuition of that idea in notions of, well, losing oneself, right? Whenever we're engaged in a task that is especially engrossing, that we really are drawn to, that really captivates us, well, we lose ourselves. We lose our sense of self. We're no longer self-conscious. When we're self-conscious, we're sort of, again, removing ourselves in our minds from a situation as if we were seeing ourselves from outside the world. Okay? That is almost now, as we see it, the definition of unhappiness, in the sense that when we are engrossed, that is when we are fundamentally happy. Happiness is not, it's been said, something that is pursuable. It's something that overtakes us when we are pursuing something that matters to us sufficiently deeply that we lose ourselves in the pursuit. So there's an aspect to the self, or the understanding of the self, that involves a certain degree of selflessness, right? And there's an aphorism that I've written about that. Selflessness, how one acts not out of need. It's something that I've found has been able to overcome phobias in my case. I used to have acrophobia, fear of heights, until I ran that aphorism through my mind, and the acrophobia just vanished, disappeared. Okay? Because when we have fears, we have a sense that our integrity, our self, is being threatened in some fundamental way. Our needs are not being addressed in some significant way, and we recoil from that. Well, one of the things that philosophy, that the investigation of rigor is able to demonstrate, is that needs are presumed. Can't know that we have specific needs. We can know that other people, have maybe demonstrated a need for oxygen. When the oxygen, supply stops, they die. Okay, but we can't know that in our case. Now I know that's extreme, right? That's an illustration of how extreme the demands of rigor are. But nothing short of rigor is able to satisfy philosophy's demands, and nothing short of rigor is capable of achieving what the religions have aspired to. Remember, philosophy is able to achieve through rigor what religions have aspired to metaphorically, in terms of faith or belief, various types of representations. Philosophy can achieve those kinds of results with an incontestable type of logic. Okay, so the selfie at the other end of the Emily Dickinson sense of selfhood represents, again, not so much the true self, but a heuristic representation of the self. And it's not going to provide the insight and the answers that philosophy is demanding. Something that is closer to the core, and again, when I say the core, like the core of philosophy's interest, I'm talking about, again, a description of the self, or an understanding of the self from within the world, from where we stand, looking out on it, not looking at a selfie as if we were, again, across the room from ourselves. One of the really kind of prescient, one of the really sort of deep representations of that aspect of the self is articulated in the Hindu tradition. Now, I'm not sure exactly when this developed, this lullaby, actually. It's something that mothers still apparently tell to their children, at night as they're trying to put them to sleep. Again, I don't know exactly when it originated, but it captures much of the essence of the Hindu religious tradition. And that is, child, you're yourself when you sleep and when you dream, and even when you are awake. Look at the world going by. Right? So there's a sense that the self is something that we can abide in, that doesn't participate in the flux, the illusion, of the world sort of moving past us. It corresponds to that philosophic notion of an epistemic point, right? The point where we exist in the world, that point that is also what I sometimes call an Einsteinian point. An Einsteinian point is one where one is at the effective still center of existence, right? That the whole point of Einstein's theory of relativity is to make it possible for us to describe each point as motionless. Because in order to establish motion, unless we could do an experiment that would show that we were in motion, which Einstein claims in the theory of relativity not to be able to do, the only way we would be able to establish motion, our motion relative to the world, was if we were seeing the world from the outside and seeing ourselves moving relative to it. Not possible. So each point, each self, is at a point, a motionless point. It's a point of dignity in that our experience is unique. Nobody is occupying this point. Nobody has ever occupied the point that we are occupying right now, the point that we occupy at every moment of our lives, whatever, wherever that point happens to be. It is a point of convergence, of universal convergence, in the sense that we can imagine wherever we are, the entire universe mapping to us, so that each of us can be said to represent the universe summed to this point. It's something that I represent. I'll show you the relationship. It's this on the bottom, HCE, the heuristic, converges to the epistemic. In other words, everything that we can imagine about the world, we can imagine converging to wherever we are. And where we are is, again, what I call an epistemic point, a point from which we can know with certainty whatever it is possible to know from our circumstance. That notion of the world converging to us is actually something that's also represented in the Hindu tradition. The notion of Atman being Brahman. Atman is the soul of the individual. Brahman is the universe, the soul of the universe. Well, that's, and from most standpoints, an obscure notion. that the soul of the individual is the soul of the universe, except when we see how we can represent it in terms of each point being a universal convergence, right? And each point is a universal convergence because we can't remove a point, an object, from the world and see how the world would be without that element, that object. Okay, you can't do that experiment even in principle. So philosophical notions can embody and again explain some of these religious notions that have been central to different faiths, but based upon a kind of again sort of an intuition, almost a poetic representation, not necessarily a logically supportable result, but philosophy achieves that kind of consequence. Now, okay, so we have several different approaches to this idea of self, right? We have the statement of humility, right? Not claiming too much about what we are or might be. We have the configuration of the selfie, seeing ourselves from the outside, which is, again, not the experiencing self that we really want to gain knowledge of, and certainly want to gain knowledge of philosophically. We have the Hindu notion, right, of the self being the center of experience around which the world revolves, which is consistent with notions of modern physics and also supported by, well, really, general sense of existentialism, that we cannot leave the world to view it from the outside. So wherever we are, is the point in relation to which everything must be described. Now, the Delphic Oracle, that appears in the title of this morning's talk, is an oracle, something that prophesies, tells the future, or reveals things from ancient Greece. It is at a location, was at a location called Delphi, hence Delphic Oracle. The temple there was built to Apollo, the god Apollo, the Greek god, which is one of the principal gods within the Greek tradition, a god, among other things, of knowledge. When the temple at Delphi was being constructed, a group of Greek statesmen, philosophers, people of wisdom got together and sought an inscription for the temple that would represent a distillation of human wisdom. Like if they had to come up with something that come to terms with this is the key to everything. Well, what they came up with was know thyself as the single most important avenue towards, well, wisdom broadly. It's something that's had a profound effect upon philosophers that have come since. It had made a major impression on Socrates. But for Socrates, the focus, I don't think, was so much for him on the self as on the concept of knowledge. The investigation of how we know anything, including the self. And most of what you see in Plato's representations of Socrates' work, his efforts, is in undermining, especially early on, undermining premature claims to know. So, Socrates is really considered to be the originator of what we call epistemology, right? the investigation of knowledge, how we know what we claim to know. The focus on the self becomes even more prominent in later, philosophers. You see it in Plato, but you especially see it in someone like, Montaigne, a French philosopher of the 16th century, who was as influenced by the work, the example of Socrates, as really any major philosophical figure that's come since Socrates. He wore a medallion, Montaigne did, on his chest. It said, "Que sais-je? What do I know?" And he himself was especially interested in gaining an understanding of the self, but not so much the self as a philosophical concept, which is what we're going to be focused on primarily now, but on the idiosyncrasies of his self, his quirks, his just the different aspects of his personality, his interests, his drives, an attempt to understand himself really almost from a psychological, perspective. And again, when we think of understanding from a psychological perspective, we're also thinking of understanding from the outside. In general, scientific understanding is imagined to be from the outside. It's one of the reasons why it doesn't rise to the level of philosophical rigor. Okay? Science in general has this notion of reality as something that is imagined to exist independently of ourselves, and it sees itself as describing the features of that independently existing reality. Well, but in terms of a general sense of the importance of coming to terms with the self, Montaigne illustrates that orientation, and it really can be traced back, in the case of Montaigne, to Socrates and to the Delphic Oracle. Know thyself. That became one of his principal passions and principal obsessions. The person that shortly after that brought it to a much more sophisticated philosophical level is Descartes. Descartes, another French philosopher, is considered really the originator of modern philosophy. And his work is very much in the spirit of the kind of philosophical orientation, that I present. The idea that it's certainty that matters. Descartes famously undertook to discover certainty by a process of universal doubt, right? He went about doubting whatever he possibly could. The nature of the external world, the nature of mathematics, any proposition that he could find some way to doubt meant it wasn't intrinsically certain, and he dismissed it. It's actually a methodology that relates to a Buddhist admonition that in the past I've also commented on. Don't seek reality. Seek to put an end to opinion. Well, that's what Descartes was doing. Anything that he could doubt was really, in his estimation, or effectively, an opinion. We don't want opinion. We want incontestability. And what we couldn't be certain about were the features of the external world, the world we see around us. We could be dreaming, right? Descartes found ways to justify doubting pretty much everything, and even the propositions of mathematics, because he would say to himself, well, maybe there's an evil demon, an evil spirit that's making me think that these propositions like 1 + 1 = 2 are correct. but maybe they're not really so. So at the end of this process, Descartes concludes that, or he realizes, and he concludes that while he's doubting everything, even if he's able to doubt everything imaginable, everything he had ever believed or thought he could know, well, he's engaged in a process of doubt. So, and doubting is a type of thinking. So that became, for Descartes, the essence of the self, right? And the essence of establishing its existence. And it took the form of a very famous, well, really aphorism. The Latin form of it, cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. Okay? And now Descartes wasn't satisfied with that statement because it doesn't say an awful lot, it doesn't give an awful lot of content to the self, right? And it certainly doesn't seem to establish his ability to claim knowledge of anything else other than that, as long as he's thinking, he's existing, okay? What he tries to do is proceed from that notion that he was comfortable with the certainty of to being able to establish the existence of a God who would not be a deceiver, so that whatever we tended to think, tended to imagine being the reality was the reality, because God would not deceive us to the degree that Descartes had been imagining it as a possibility when he was going through this process of systematic doubt. That's not too convincing, okay? So it's not, well, Descartes can't quite get from that first proposition, I think, therefore I am, to anything really, anything assertable, that can, again, stand a test of rigor. And even that proposition has a little bit of an issue with it, in the sense that it's not quite clear Descartes is in a position to sort of use the term I, in that context. It's been said actually that he was only actually legitimately able to claim there is some thinking going on here, okay? But the most important aspect of that, especially in terms of what we're trying to accomplish here, is that the self is the indispensable place to begin with when we're doing philosophy, because it's, again, the place that we cannot leave. And so if we're going to be able to be certain of anything, it will be in relation to something immediate to us, something immediately that we're experiencing, something immediately that we're undergoing as a process, like in the case of Descartes, the process of thinking. It's that immediacy that connects it to philosophy's interest in achieving the incontrovertible. That is ultimately the force of the Delphigorical admonition, in the sense that the self is the only thing that we are likely to be able to know incontrovertibly, or at a high level of certainty, at a level perhaps of rigor, because again, it's close to us. When I used to, well, even now, when I do philosophy, I will start with where I am. I'll get up in the morning and I'll look around and I'll sort of evaluate my sense of the world based upon my immediate circumstances, because that is going to be the only thing that can rise to the level of something indisputable. Okay? So, and we also see that tradition continuing, that focus on the self, because the self is immediate. And so it's something that we have access to, something we have unique access to. I mean, that's going to turn into a decisive notion, as we'll see as well. That tradition of the focus on the self continues with someone like Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a Swiss writer, philosopher, who was the author of The Social Contract in the 18th century, probably the most important intellectual influence upon the French Revolution. In the case of the American Revolution, it was more the writings of John Locke about effectively the social contract, that the people ultimately were, the power that the government had ultimately was invested or was given to the government by the people. And the people could withdraw that authority from the government if the government was not basically fulfilling its obligations, its dutiful role, to preserve and protect, the welfare of the people. There's a famous opening line to Rousseau's work. People are everywhere. Oh my goodness, I forget the. People are born free, but they are everywhere in chains. So, but again, Rousseau famously wrote this work, The Confessions, in which he, like Montaigne, was studiously focused upon himself, coming to terms with himself. And we see this tradition from really the 18th century forward. It's a romantic with a capital R for romanticism, a romantic interest in one's experience and the authenticity of one's experience, because again, one can make claims about one's experience that no one else can make, and that can be substantiated more than the claims that one can make about something that's happening on the far side of the universe, let's say. So, again, the focus on the self is a theme, from the Delphic Oracle, continuing into actually the work of a person I've probably mentioned more often than any other philosopher, Wittgenstein, whose philosophical investigations have been said to be a work about self-knowledge, coming to terms with who and what we are. Okay, so now I've mentioned that the fundamental obligation, that we have in coming to terms with, philosophical truth, philosophical claims, is to do it from within the world, from where we stand. That's existentialism, okay? Though, as I've also mentioned in the past, I haven't quite ever met someone who's articulated it, to that degree. But if you read through existentialist writings, you'll see that ultimately, if you read them from the perspective of we cannot leave the world to view it from the outside, you'll see that everything that existentialism is saying, as long as it's like within the spirit of existentialism, is consistent with that notion. The person seen as the progenitor of that, the originator of that orientation is Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher Kierkegaard. And it's Kierkegaard who actually addresses this notion of the self most intriguingly. And I'm going to read you a paragraph from Kierkegaard in just a second. But again, if we want to understand, like, why should an incipient, a beginning existentialist, or someone at the start of the existentialist orientation, why should they be writing about the self? Well, because again, you cannot leave it. So you cannot leave the world, view it from the outside. You cannot leave yourself. So you must start there. So Kierkegaard is going to, in a sense, start there. Now let me read you what he wrote, and I'll have a few things to say about it. I think you're going to find this interesting, because again, even though Kierkegaard is seen as the originator of existentialism, he would not have articulated its meaning in the way that I've been doing. And I think some of the issues that one might find in his writing is because even though he's understanding the importance of coming to terms with things from where we are, from the standpoint of ourselves, he's not always totally doing that, okay? So this is the opening paragraph from a very famous work of his called The Sickness Unto Death. Now, one of the things about Kierkegaard is that even though he's one of the great philosophers, he was writing from a Christian position, ultimately. So, and as his works developed, his later and later works are more really expositions of Christian orthodoxy, or an attempt to understand the nature of Christianity and the Christian experience, the Christian hope, the Christian promise. But Sickness Unto Death was sort of an earlier work, or middle sort of work, where there's a lot of philosophical investigation taking place. And here is how Kierkegaard begins this work, The Sickness Unto Death. He writes, and by the way, in the translation that I have, there are references to, man. Man is this. I'm changing that to a person, right? So a person is spirit. But what is spirit? Spirit is the self. But what is the self? The self is a relation which relates itself to its own self, or it is that in the relation which accounts for it that the relation relates itself to its own self. The self is not the relation, but consists in the fact that the relation relates itself to its own self. A person is a synthesis of the infinite and the finite, of the temporal and the eternal, of freedom and necessity. In short, it is a synthesis. A synthesis is a relation between two factors. So regarded, a person is not yet a self. Okay, now, first thing, I think we can agree, that almost makes no sense, right? That is not clear. Okay. It's overwritten. It does not achieve a distilled, philosophical representation of the nature of the self. And you'll notice that at the end, the conclusion is that, a human being is not yet a self, right, in general. To some degree, that sort of almost scholastic, that almost like overly technical, confusingly written, philosophical statement is a joke. It's almost I think Kierkegaard here is he's parodying, he's making fun of a philosophical tradition which was embraced by a contemporary philosopher that Kierkegaard did not have high regard for, and that's Hegel, a German philosopher who was, as much as anything, seen as a philosopher of history. His work had a profound influence upon the work of Karl Marx, and it's really an attempt to describe the world from outside the world. And that is exactly what Kierkegaard, instinctually is resisting, rebelling against, again, even if he's not fully clearly articulating it. So what we have here is a little bit of poking fun at that attempt to describe a concept like the self as if we were seeing it from, again, outside, our experience. So that's one main reason for its confusion, right? It's intentionally confusing. It's not helping us, right? It doesn't help us understand the concept. And there's another reason for the issue that it presents, especially in terms of that conclusion of man not yet, or human being not yet being a self. And that is that Kierkegaard, as a Christian, is seeing the relationship between a human being and God, that relationship, as fundamental to his philosophical enterprise, spiritual enterprise, his whole sort of vocation, as a writer and as a thinker. He's interested in coming to terms with what it means to be, in his case, a Christian. In fact, he wrote, basically just those words, that all of his writings can be seen as his own education in Christianity. So he's interested in something that already, is involving, well, again, not coming to terms with the self as an epistemic point from which everything has to be understood, but understanding a relationship between two things, one of which is present, the self, and the other not quite present. He sees, again, the concept of God as something distinct. So it's not going to achieve, and ultimately, Kierkegaard does embrace Christian doctrine. A lot of that type of doctrine is not going to be embraceable, right, by philosophy. Kierkegaard is avowedly a person of faith. He's asserting, the ultimate value of faith. That phrase, the leap of faith, is something that he might have invented, he might have coined it. He certainly embraced it. And notions of faith and belief, belief in God, belief in this case, the redemptive power of Christ, is not something that philosophy is going to embrace on its surface, because philosophy is, from the outset, dismissing belief, opinion, theory, faith. It wants the incontrovertible. Now, it might, in the end, my contention, and I've developed this at various times, in past talks, is that the rigor of philosophy is capable of achieving effectively what mystical union with God, like one extreme form of Christian fulfillment, is imagined to embody, embrace, and ultimately accomplish. So, but in terms of articles of Christian faith that Kierkegaard is personally embracing, Well, that's a non-philosophical, part of his enterprise. But you can see that the effort to describe the self from outside the self, even if one's interested in describing a relationship with, say God, is philosophically problematic, right? And it certainly, when I read that, doesn't provide genuine illumination. Not to me, anyway. So, what is, well, let me just see something here. Okay. So, what is the rigorous philosophical position regarding the nature of the self? And how is it going to affect our understanding of ourselves and senses of possibility, limitation, destiny, large issues that human beings confront and address? Well, it's going to be found here, right? I mean, if this is a distillation of philosophy per se, philosophy as I'm representing it, then ultimately our understanding of the self in lots of different dimensions has to be contained within these simple representations. And here's how that can be elaborated. Now, just to review quickly, the first one, the heuristic, A equals A, that's the space in which any two things are approximately the same, conceptually the same for some purpose, right? Two chairs are chairs, they're distinct objects, but they are both chairs because they can both satisfy a certain function, fulfill a certain purpose for us. They can be used in a certain way, okay? But they are rigorously distinct. In heuristic space, any two things can be approximately the same. In epistemic space, any two things are rigorously distinct. We exist in epistemic space, but within society, within language, within political structures, we elaborate heuristic or heuristics. And heuristics are things that help us achieve goals and help us survive in various ways. Like, for example, we know that a hot stove can burn and we need to avoid touching it. We know that anything that resembles a hot stove can burn and should be avoided. Well, that's the nature of a heuristic. Two things that are similar that we need to treat in similar ways. We can be treating them in similar ways to achieve a goal, like tools, interchangeable parts of cell phones. But in terms of how things exist, we exist fundamentally in difference from everything else. That's the nature of the epistemic, right? Any two things are approximately the same in heuristic space, are rigorously different in epistemic space. The reality, the ultimate reality, is the epistemic. The heuristic is what beliefs and opinions and theories, anything that's not rigorously justifiable, is heuristic. Well, putting all of this together, we can say that the self is how we differ from everything else. And you can say, well, but I don't know, what if we're a doctor and somebody else is a doctor? We're not, differing from them in being doctors. No, the category of doctor is heuristic. For one thing, it represents a role, something that is aiming for a certain end or achieving some sort of purpose, helping human beings, achieve a state of health, let's say. But in terms of our existence as a self, we can be a doctor, but we are not the same doctor. And we are not the same in our practice of medicine. It is everything that distinguishes us from everything else that makes us fundamentally what we are. The self exists in distinction from everything else. Now, so that's the fundamental philosophical condition of selfhood. That's why the self embraces dignity, right? Because it's absolutely unique, and it's unique and it's irreplaceable. It's not interchangeable. Two chairs are interchangeable, right? Because they can both satisfy the same purpose. But two human beings rigorously are not interchangeable. Our experience is unique. Our circumstance is unique. We are unique. The self is unique. And it is that uniqueness, whatever distinguishes us from everything else, that we exist by virtue of, and that our selfhood ultimately consists of. Now, there is a famous comment by the 20th century diarist, Anais Nin. It's a remarkable sort of statement, and it captures a lot of certain aspects of the history of philosophical thought. And that is, she wrote, "We see things not as they are, we see them as we are." Now, it's compelling, and part of what that means is, for example, different species see colors differently, right, than we do. Our senses are ultimately what's responsible for coloring the world in the way we are experiencing it. So what we're experiencing is being processed, right, by our brain. So what we're seeing around, if we were a bumblebee, we would be seeing in the ultraviolet. If we were various kinds of sea creatures, there are sea creatures that have, well, we have 3 basic photoreceptors for color in our eyes. There are sea creatures that have 12. They see the world differently, okay? Dogs, studies have shown that, different animals, see colors to different degrees. Some see, at wavelengths of light that other species are not responsive to, okay? So this notion of the senses coloring the world of our experience is really an ancient kind of understanding. And it's something that is fundamental in the work of a philosopher like Kant, Immanuel Kant, a German philosopher, a great German philosopher, who, again, recognized that we couldn't leave the world. We can't leave the world to see it from the outside. So we can't really know the nature of the things that we're encountering as if we were seeing them from the outside. We can't know what they would be seen as if we didn't have our senses as they're constituted. So a lot of, like for Kant, our experience of the world is being processed by our mind, by our brain, and that's giving us the representations of reality. It's as if our brain, our mind, were a virtual reality device. Okay? And in that sense, we are not seeing the world as it is, but we are seeing our how we process the world. But there's an even deeper aspect, to the sense of what our self is doing to the representation of the world that we're coming to terms with. Basically, whatever is rigorous, right, is epistemic, it's existential, it exists in difference from everything else. The heuristic is a matter of, again, like opinion, theory, assumption, belief. When we look around and we see objects, we're seeing heuristics. We're seeing things that are clustered together, for certain purposes. When we look at a chair, we're seeing something that represents a sum of past experience, present sensation, future expectation. It's a convergence. The elements of heuristic space represent convergences, things that come together to form objects, are clustered together. Basically, everything that we see heuristically, everything in heuristic space reveals to us the process of our mind operating upon the epistemic reality around us. And let me give you some specific examples of that. So we want to come to understand what are, aside from our pure existence, as a unique object in distinction from everything else, we can get a sense of what our mind is doing to experience by imagining the following kinds of circumstances. A tree falls in a forest, there's no one there to observe it. Okay? Does it make a sound? That's a classic philosophical conundrum, right? That classic philosophical question. Most people say yes, right? The laws of physics, govern, the production of sound. And whether we're there or not, there's going to be energy given off by the falling tree, and that energy is going to cause, motion of air particles, and that if it were to encounter, an observer, like a human being, would register a sound. So, yes. But from a philosophical standpoint, from a standpoint of rigor, we've set the situation up so that we can't make sure, right? We can't know for sure, right? We're sort of guessing, if you like. What we're actually doing is filling in, almost like filling in the dots, okay? Well, whenever we're talking about something that we cannot directly experience, and so cannot rise to the level of an incontrovertible claim, whatever we say about that situation is our mind, our brain, sort of projecting onto the world, okay? So what we say in a situation like that is diagnostic of what our mind is doing to construct heuristic space, a space of approximations for certain purposes, okay? Often social, societal purposes. Okay? So, same thing is true. What's the nature of the world behind my back? Okay. Well, what you say reveals your mind to yourself, reveals the operation of yourself on experience. If you say, well, the world behind your back is what you would see if you turned around. Well, not rigorously so, only within the assumptions, the simplifications, the oversimplifications in many instances that create heuristic space. Heuristic space is the functional projection, of the human mind. There are other situations. The one I like to refer to is what's going on behind these walls. Right? I'm in an interior here. I don't see the world outside. What might we say about the world outside beyond those walls? Whatever we say, since we're not directly experiencing it, and since we cannot know for sure, whatever we say is heuristic, and whatever we say reveals the operation of the self in organizing experience. But it's something from which we can free ourselves, because if we are aware of it, it turns out, right, as we've seen, that rigor is a stronger instrument than belief or theory or assumption. So let me see if, one second, I just want to see about, okay, I want to get to our question, but let me just sort of bring this to a conclusion. Okay, so the most important thing about our circumstance is that from where we stand, we can know of our world, know of our existence, but what we can't know is our sense of limitations. Okay, if we want to ask ourselves or address the question of what are we capable of, well, we can only demonstrate capability by application. We can't know, because our circumstance is unique, what might not be possible. So from our specific set of circumstances, from where we exist, we can't know that we have any specific types of limitations. Like the best example of that I've given before is Van Gogh. Right? Van Gogh had no inherent artistic ability that he showed at the age of 27. If he had asked a drawing teacher, for guidance, the drawing teacher would have said, find a different career. Okay? But he pursued his passion, right? He pursued his admiration. And eventually, after a period of 10 years of devoted work, became arguably the most popular great painter who ever lived. Well, so that's the other side of it. We can't know our limitations, right? Because our circumstance is unique. We could only know limitation from outside if we were observing ourselves from the outside. So what do we do? In what direction do we proceed in at least exploring our possibilities? Well, the best guide that I know is another Hindu proverb, which is, you become what you admire. You pursue what you most admire no matter what. That's the only thing ultimately that can provide deep satisfaction. And from within the world, from our circumstances, we can't know that our admiration will not be achievable, not ever, until we die. But death is not something that's experienceable, and so it's not part of our epistemic reality. So we are free to engage in whatever direction our admirations are most committed to, and we can do so with the freedom from any potential limitation that can only be imposed and be known to be imposable from the outside, which is not our circumstance. So the self is how we differ from everything else, how we heuristic space, the characteristics of the space around us are what our self sort of projects into that. But the ultimate reality is that of the epistemic, that of our distinction from everything else, and that frees us to explore whatever our passion may turn out to be. And that's something that only we can know. It's having a self is a sacred obligation. It's an obligation of being true to the uniqueness of our circumstances that no one else can ever fully glean. And so no one else can ever legitimately judge, and no one else can ever legitimately impose limitations upon, not legitimately. Okay. Well, as I said, the self is an enormous topic to explore, and it has a tendency to lead in every conceivable direction because it's where we always have to start from. So there's a lot more, that we could talk about in relation to it, but I think at this point I should go on to a very interesting question that I got at the end of last time and didn't have time for. And let me read that question. I think I can read the question. Oh, here it is. Okay, so the question is, okay, so the question is, recently Larry King died. The person writing this says he was the best interviewer, in his or her eyes. About 2 years ago, I guess Neil deGrasse Tyson was a guest. And the question, I'm guessing Larry King posed this question to Tyson: if you could live forever, would you? Okay. Fascinating and significant question. One of the things that I'm interested in philosophically, and not just me, Einstein was interested in it, Wittgenstein, Malraux, whom I've talked about before, is the riddle of the world, right? When Einstein was 11 years old, he wrote in one of his notebooks, "I want to solve the riddle of the great big world." Okay? It was also like a focus of Wittgenstein. It's been a philosophical focus. Now, what is the riddle of the world? Well, there are lots of ways to characterize it. What's going on here? What is this? What does this amount to? What is the meaning, the purpose, the end, of existence, right? Okay, the riddle of the world. Malraux characterized it as the supreme riddle of what am I doing on this earth where sorrow reigns? And the reason for that characterization is that when we are happy, we are engaged. We're not sort of seeing the world from the outside. And that question about what does it all mean doesn't arise. It arises when we're unengaged or disengaged at a distance. And it's suffering that represents that type of distancing, whereas happiness, like suffering, tends to focus one on suffering, on oneself, whereas happiness tends to be a condition in which one loses oneself. Okay? So the riddle of the world tends, as a consideration, to arise when one's addressing or considering problematic aspects of the world. But that's what has been the source of the great religions, right? Siddhartha Gautama was inspired by the issue of disease, old age, and death. The Christian, Judaic, Islamic traditions, have been responsive to the question of the fall of humanity, right? The loss of the Garden of Eden, and the attempt to reclaim some of that, or that primal condition of grace. Well, in that play, Phalaris's Bull, Solving the Riddle of the Great Big World, I talk about the riddle of the world. And one thing I mention in it is endless life doesn't solve the riddle of the world. It just prolongs it. So from a philosophical standpoint, endless life is not a solution. It's also not a solution in another way. It's been said that for Western cultures, Western civilization, broadly speaking, the fundamental reality is death, and certainly the fundamental issue is death. Whereas for Eastern cultures, it's been said that the fundamental reality is the endlessness of life in the endlessness of time. That cycle of birth and rebirth and rebirth. So that a Buddhist sort of orientation is partly to escape the wheel, escape that endless cycle where the solution is not eternal life, because in a sense, that's what one is condemned to. The solution is in the form of a cessation, an ending, of this process that one can otherwise not easily escape from. So both endless life and death can, present inherent problems, right? Also, with the question of endless life, there's the consideration as to what form that life would take, right? The myth of Sisyphus is a Greek myth in which Sisyphus, for some infraction, I forget exactly what led to his punishment, but Sisyphus's punishment was having to roll a boulder up a hill, beginning in the morning of every day. At the end of the day, the boulder would fall back down to the base of the hill, and he'd have to resume the process the next day. So every day he was at the bottom of the hill, having to roll the boulder up, and every night it would fall back down. Okay? And it was an endless process. He was condemned to this forever. It's actually the title of a work by the French existentialist writer, philosopher, Albert Camus. It was one of the earliest works I read in philosophy. Camus was actually, in that work, able to find a reason for Sisyphus being happy. Well, the main reason would be if Sisyphus were engaged if he were committed, right, to that activity. But The problem is when the ball or the boulder rolls back down again, there's that moment of clarity, of awareness, of this endless, futile task. That disengagement is what's the condemnation, right? That's what becomes the intolerable feature of the experience. On the other hand, I've mentioned Kierkegaard repeatedly. There's a work of Kierkegaard's called Stages on Life's Way, in which he reflects upon his work and his life as a writer, ultimately trying to understand and explain the nature of Christianity, the Christian experience. And at the end of his work, he talks about how historically, he will have died of a mortal disease, but poetically, of a longing for eternity, where uninterruptedly he would have nothing else to do but to give thanks to God. So in that kind of situation, where one is absorbed in that endless act of gratitude, well, one can imagine that being a satisfying experience. The important philosophical point here, though, is that one can never know that one would live forever, no matter what. In other words, like one of my aphorisms is, there is no death. The world can end at any time, or at different times, for different people. No matter what our circumstances, we can't guarantee that whatever it is we're involved in will continue indefinitely. Right? That's what we have no command over. Ultimately, even the sense of being able to live forever feels like a condemnation. I've already, explained how within Eastern thought, that's not the solution. That's the problem. So the solution actually relates more to an awareness of, again, the rigor of our circumstances, namely, we cannot know. And among the things that we cannot know, that is central and vital to our ultimate fulfillment is that we will die. That is not part of epistemic reality. That's not part of our possible experience. That's, again, imagining the world from the outside. So what I am able to embrace and what I willingly embrace is, well, really, but the concept of time, in that we don't know what is coming next. We don't know that we are going to die. We can only know that from the outside or from making comparisons to other people's circumstances, other people's fates. But again, any difference between our circumstance and anyone else's means whatever has applied to anyone else need not apply to us. So what I embrace is the rigor of our circumstance, and again the question arises really from imagining the ability to see things from the outside where we could even know that such a thing was possible, and such a thing cannot be known. And for good reason. It's our salvation to embrace what we can legitimately know. I've written a lot of aphorisms about this. One that comes to mind right now is, we suffer that we presume to the end of time. We presume what the nature of this experience is. We presume how it's going to play itself out. We presume what we are in relation to it. All of these represent presumptions that go beyond what we can legitimately claim. And insofar as we are making presumptions beyond what we can legitimately claim, we are setting ourselves up for suffering of various types. So our freedom ultimately is in the rigor of our circumstance and the inability to know even that we will die.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Stephen. Unfortunately, our time is up, but before we wrap it up, we would again thank you very much for such an amazing talk today. We had a great topic, and you prepared such nice aphorisms and all the information. Thank you very much one more time for taking your time and joining us weekly. Also, we would like to thank the U.S. Consulate General here in Almaty and also American Space Almaty. Please feel free to join and visit us. And talking about the philosophical talks, we have got some comments. People keep sending me hello. Then this lady, Katrina Bulanova, joins us weekly. So thank you very much, Katrina, for joining us. And also she gives big thanks and sending big thanks to you, as well as, Horace, and thank you. And also one more comment from the Kazakh Math Academy. They are saying, hello, nice to meet you here. I liked the first session and so happy to see you again and have a chance to listen to your speech and answers. Thank you very much, Kazakh Math Academy. And talking about the questions, we have got a question from this lady, Katrina. I'm going to read it out. What do you think about America's existential crisis? And what about failed traditions? Nuclear family, God, and national pride. What will happen to social structures in, let's say, 10 years? Such a great question, and I think we will be able to answer it next Friday. Thank you very much, Katrina, for your question. Such a nice question. Thank you,
Very
Steve.
good. Okay, well, thank you very much, Aaliyah, and I want to thank everyone for joining, and I hope people will be able to join again next week. We'll have a new topic, and I will answer that question and any questions that might arise in the course of next week's talk.
Mm-hmm. One more time, thank you very much, you all, for joining us. We are waiting for you next week. Please stay safe and see you all. Thank you one more time. Have a great week.
Thank you, everyone. Bye now. Bye-bye.
Goodbye. Thank you.